Yusuke Urameshi is one of the most iconic delinquent characters in anime, and one of the most popular protagonists in general. It's not just the fact that he's ready to throw hands with anyone, but it's also his constant trash talking and slick comebacks which makes him so iconic, especially in the English dub. But in addition to that, we also get to see the reasons for his delinquent behavior, which adds that depth to his characters that most other characters of this archetype lack. One of the most common character motivations in battle shonen is the desire for battle. And there's a good reason why. In a genre defined by its fights, it's narratively convenient to have a character that is willing to fight without having to create any deeper reasons to facilitate the action. Usually, it either comes in the form of a humble martial artist looking for a challenge for the sake of bettering himself, or the battle-hardened warrior who's looking to satiate his thirst for battle and would be even content in dying. But this kind of motivation isn't very relatable for the average person, making it very rare to see this type of character getting any more depth than that. But what sets Yusuke Urameshi apart from the rest is he has both that larger-than-life personality, but in addition is a down-to-earth and relatable character. Yusuke is a great character because he takes the shonen power fantasy ideas of power-ups, demon transformations, and battles and grounds it into themes about growing up and adolescence. Yusuke's development and character arc isn't just learning, but also integrating parts of himself that he's been suppressing. And throughout the story, Yusuke goes through the hero's journey in 3 different occasions, each time integrating a different aspect of himself. In this video, we're going to be exploring the depth of Yusuke's character and how he grows into a more complete person throughout the story. Yusuke's introduction seems counterintuitive because it purposely portrays him as unlikable as possible. Sure, he does have his iconic delinquent persona, but there's nothing about it that's admirable, demonstrated by the fact that all of the interactions that he has with the key figures of his life are negative, even the ones who are genuinely trying to help him. From the outside, he's exactly as the narration describes him on the first page, a worthless punk. But as we continue to follow Yusuke, that's when we see the roots of his behavioral issues. Now there are a lot of contenders for the worst dad in anime award, but Yusuke's dad is such a deadbeat that he doesn't even show up for the anime adaptation. It's only in the manga does he make an appearance, and we learn that he left Yusuke and his mom when he was just 3. Yusuke's mother Atsuko is only 15 years older than her son, and is a heavy drinker and smoker, and she's extremely neglectful of Yusuke, and disappears for long stretches of time, making her money through shady means that are only subtly hinted at in the manga. This broken home explains why Yusuke lacks any discipline or respect, but also why he lacks a role model for how to express himself through his adolescence. As a result, this is why he uses fighting as an outlet to express his frustration and dissatisfaction with his life. This motivation for fighting is so much more human and relatable, especially to the younger audience of the series, as opposed to the other protagonists of this archetype that we talked about earlier, who are more like forces of nature. It's only after Yusuke is characterized as a flawed but relatable character that Togashi redeems him to the audience. The selfish punk persona of Yusuke falls away as he surprisingly does the most selfish act possible, sacrificing his life for someone else. This seemingly contradicts Yusuke's persona that the story has been developing so far, but that's because it simply is that, a persona. After we've peeked into Yusuke's home life, it becomes very difficult to view him on the surface level as a worthless delinquent like many of his teachers do. Yusuke's sacrifice was so unexpected that the staff of the afterlife hadn't even decided where they're going to send him yet. The story stresses the idea that, while on the surface the persona that Yusuke puts on is cold and violent, in his core, Yusuke is a kind-hearted kid, and this is illustrated beautifully through Yusuke's ordeal. Yusuke's death serves as a crossing of the threshold, which in the hero's journey is the first step into the unknown world. Yusuke becomes a ghost that is unable to interact with the physical world, which strips away his sole coping mechanism of fighting. As a result, Yusuke has to learn to use non-violent ways to solve his problems. The anime adaptation actually cuts out a lot of Yusuke's ghost adventures, which is kind of a shame because this section of the story shows us the good Yusuke is capable of when he's given the opportunity. The purity of Yusuke's soul is shown again through the egg that Koenma gives him as a test. The egg feeds on Yusuke's spirit energy and would hatch either into an atrocious monster or a cute creature, depending on the nature of Yusuke's soul. It turns out to be the latter when it hatches in the Dark Tournament arc. Pooh is a very soft and vulnerable looking creature, reflecting Yusuke's true soul, and while Pooh leaves Yusuke vulnerable to the ridicule of his friends, but this vulnerability is very necessary for Yusuke's journey to become a more emotionally sincere person and accept who he really is at his core, which is what Pooh represents. It's only after Yusuke goes through this ordeal, having to build up virtue by helping spirits and his friends in the human world, and by having a literal death and rebirth, that Yusuke is granted a second shot at life. And this new Yusuke, having now integrated that noble piece of his soul into himself, is now appointed as the new spirit detective. The second journey that Yusuke goes on takes it one step further. While Yusuke now fights for the right reasons, he hasn't made that his sole mission. The thing that Yusuke lacks but needs the most is discipline. Yusuke's principal, Mr. Takanaka, is unappreciated for this reason, because he has been one of the few people who has seen the good within Yusuke from the start and try to put him on the right path. Unfortunately for him, Yusuke's personality isn't suited for conventional education, and there was no way for him to know or understand that Yusuke would find his calling fighting spirits and demons, which is why Genkai is such a great mentor for Yusuke. When we talk about the best mentors in anime, a lot of the discussion is centered around the skills that the mentor teaches the heroes. Genkai is no slouch in this aspect, as she increases Yusuke's power massively before the Dark Tournament by teaching him how to control his spirit energy. Spirit energy, or Reiki, is nowhere near as developed and complex as Togashi's later and heavily praised power system of Nen. In fact, Reiki is almost identical in function to Dragon Ball's Ki, but what makes it so much more impactful narratively is how Reiki is tied with the emotions of the characters. What really makes a mentor great is not simply progressing the protagonist in terms of power, but progressing them as a person as well. Genkai's tough and stern training provided Yusuke that discipline that he sorely needed, teaching him to control his spirit, in both the literal and figurative sense of the word. Yusuke crosses the threshold once again as he enters the Dark Tournament, and it's actually uncanny how much the storyline correlates with the hero's journey. Arriving at the Dark Tournament arena on Hangneck Island is a clear crossing of the threshold into the unknown world, and the demons that Team Urameshi fight in the early rounds are the trials, enemies, and eventually the allies that define the next stage. The cave scene in the Dark Tournament arc is almost perfectly analogous to the next phase of the hero's journey, entering the innermost cave, where the hero must face his shadow during the hardest trial that he's faced so far. For Yusuke, this is the dilemma in which he must kill Genkai in order to gain the power to defeat Toguro. This forces Yusuke to dig the deepest within himself and give the most sincere and vulnerable answer that we've seen from him so far. Yusuke ultimately refuses, and Genkai reveals that it was just a test and taking in her spirit orb was the real trial. The elixir, as a symbol, is the reward or lesson of the hero's journey, and in this arc, that is Genkai's spirit orb. Genkai's spirit orb represents the lesson of embracing humanity and the emotion that intrinsically comes with it, and Yusuke inherits and integrates this lesson in Genkai's spirit as he faces death and rebirth. This leads to the most recognizable phase in the hero's journey, which is the death of the mentor to the hand of the villain, which sets the stage for the final confrontation. With Yusuke firmly established as our archetypal hero and Genkai as the mentor, then that leaves Toguro as the final important piece of the equation, the villain. After the death of her students, Genkai took the human path and moved forward, and this eventually led to her finding new students. Genkai's philosophy embraces the mortality intrinsic to humanity, so because of that, she decides to pass the torch to Yusuke. Toguro, on the other hand, serves as both the dragon that guards the treasure, being the final opponent in the tournament, but also the embodiment of the shadow, which is the dark aspects of a hero's soul. I've already made an entire video dedicated to dissecting Toguro and his relation to Genkai and Yusuke. So to keep it short, Toguro shows what Yusuke could have been if he had taken the wrong path. Toguro's decision to reject humanity and turn into a demon is grounded in a metaphor about Yusuke's journey through adolescence and into manhood. We see this with a juxtaposition between his mentor being a tiny old woman and his enemy as this towering, muscle-bound, 80s action hero-inspired character. Toguro is such a walking caricature of masculinity to the point where he literally isn't human anymore and has abandoned his emotions as a result. Toguro is able to push Yusuke to the point where he's finally able to release his full power only by releasing his emotions, embracing his humanity and Genkai's spirit, and sincerely devoting himself to fighting for his friends. Now, I know the power of friendship is one of the most overused and disliked tropes and themes, but Yusuke's character in the Dark Tournament arc shows that it can still be very powerful when executed with as much nuance and maturity as this series does. In his final note after the serialization of Yu Yu Hakusho, the series author, Yoshihiro Togashi, writes that he felt as if he'd fully explored and fleshed out his characters, and we can see this especially with Yusuke's character, who has come an extremely long way from his first appearance, and if his character arc had ended here, I don't think many people would have been unsatisfied. Togashi was unfortunately pressured to keep serializing the manga, and he stated that he either could have kept repeating the same storylines, or he could have started to deconstruct his characters, which was turned down. But I believe that the character arc that Yusuke goes in the second half of the story actually does serve to deconstruct the previous part, by pitting the lesson that Yusuke learned in the previous arc against his newfound nature. And the principal cause for this shift in the story, without a doubt, is Shinobu Sensui. Now, I've devoted an entire video to dissecting the Chapter Black arc and the existential themes about humanity that it presents, and I've done the same for Shinobu Sensui's character and psychology. But this time I really want to focus on how this affects Yusuke's character. While Yusuke has learned to embrace his emotions and his relationships, becoming a more sincere and integrated human, he's still not completely satisfied. The lesson that Yusuke learns during the Dark Tournament arc is that he fights for the sake of his friends. But as we see in the beginning of both the Chapter Black and the Three Kings arc, Yusuke still has an aching desire to fight, even though his friends are not in any sort of danger. Now, I believe the lesson of embracing your emotions and connections is a great and extremely relevant message, especially for the young male audience of the series. But by having the main villain being a caricature of masculinity who is a demon, it literally demonizes masculinity, even if Toguro was only intended to represent the unhealthiest kind. So through Sensui's character and the Chapter Black arc, the story starts to question and deconstruct this human path that Yusuke has been taking so far, culminating in the reveal that Yusuke is a yokai himself. I believe this message is even more relevant for the young male audience of today, because the lack of purpose that Yusuke was experiencing at the start of these arcs is getting more and more common in the modern day. The story deconstructs the previous lessons once again. Yusuke at this point in the story has grown a lot and learned that it's okay to reach out to others regarding his emotions. But it turns out that there isn't anyone in the human realm capable of helping him. Yusuke first reaches out to his boss and his first mentor, who taught him his signature move, Koenma. But he's fundamentally different from Yusuke, because he isn't a fighter at all. While Yusuke is an undisciplined delinquent, Koenma is a child who's constantly under the thumb and being disciplined by his father. Koenma then refers Yusuke to Genkai, who's admittedly a much better role model for him, but she isn't the perfect role model. Genkai is a fighter like Yusuke, and she's probably the most pivotal person in his development, giving him the discipline that he gravely needed to put him on the right path. But Genkai fails as a role model for Yusuke, the same way that someone with a fast metabolism isn't the greatest role model for someone who's trying to lose weight. Genkai can't really teach Yusuke to deal with a problem that she's never really faced herself. We've seen that Genkai has had a bloody past, but we've never seen her struggle with aggression and violence like Yusuke and Toguro did. Yusuke and Toguro both struggle with this aggression after the death of their friends, but while Toguro chose to be a demon, Yusuke was chosen in a sense by his genetics. We even see that during Yusuke's awakening, Pooh, who is the embodiment of Yusuke's inner self, becomes a monstrous beast as well, mirroring Yusuke's internal change. What Yusuke really needs is a role model that shares his demon aggression, but who can integrate it in a healthy way. And since the girl was a negative depiction of masculinity, it's essential and only fair to have a positive male role model for Yusuke to follow. And that person is Raizen. Raizen is rarely talked about as a mentor to Yusuke compared to Genkai, and that is most likely because of how little screen time he gets. But I think there's also a bias in people's mind of what a mentor should be. Raizen is really an even bigger delinquent than Yusuke, and just like father and son, they actually have a lot in common, as they immediately start trash talking and fighting mere moments after they first met. Being a Mazoke, Raizen shares that same aggression that Yusuke does, but aggression doesn't always equal violence, and Raizen is actually pretty disciplined with his aggression. Raizen had decided to stop eating humans when he met Yusuke's ancestral mother. Changing his entire ideology because of one human seems kinda flimsy at first, but this motif of a beastly man being civilized by women is seen in even Disney and goes as far back as the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is relevant in regards to Yusuke, as Keiko has been the main motivator for him to stay in the civilized world, whether it be school or the human realm. Raizen as a mentor shows Yusuke that even after integrating himself and accepting his nature, it doesn't exclude him from discipline and his human side. So it is in the final battle against Yomi where Yusuke finally fully integrates himself and ties together everything in the story. In the midst of this battle, Yusuke faces a dilemma where he really isn't sure what reason he fights for. We've seen in the Spirit Detective saga that Yusuke fights merely as a coping mechanism, a way to express his anger, but by the end he discovers that there's a noble part of himself. Then during the Dark Tournament arc, Yusuke learns to be more vulnerable and human, devoting his fighting exclusively for the sake of his friends. Yet afterwards, Yusuke still has a desire to fight, and discovers his new nature, in which his desire stems from. Yusuke's conclusion is all about him accepting all of it. Yusuke does have an innate desire to fight regardless, but he's going to use it for a noble purpose, to fight for his friends. And this integration and balance is shown in Yusuke combining his human and demon energies. And although he doesn't end up winning, he's able to set up the Demon World Tournament, which will allow him to fight and get his aggression out, but also return to human world for the sake of what he fights for in the first place, his friends. Yusuke's character is a great example of how to integrate the darker aspects of yourself while still transmuting them into a healthy and productive form. But what do you think about Yusuke's character arc? And what impact has Yu Yu Hakusho had on you? Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. And also be sure to watch my other Yu Yu Hakusho character and arc dissections, especially the Three Kings arc, where I try to dissect and fix the incomplete ending. You may be surprised who the final villain was intended to be. But with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next dissection.